is Decoy Voice. If you've not seen or heard any of his stuff before, he's Korean American. Was originally living in California. Don't know where he lives now, but probably started as a centrist, maybe leaning left. He um, had some life experiences that started pushing him more conservative, and then the more he started looking into the politics of things, it pushed him definitely down the conservative path. Now, if you consider the zeitgeist as to what people would describe him as, they'd say, oh, he's far, well, if they've considered Charlie Kirk extreme right, then he's also extreme right. Not even far right. But I find listening to what he has to say is often a conservative viewpoint mixed with a certain degree of liberalism. But he certainly does fall down on the conservative side of centrism. Now, again, depending on where your own politics stands, will depend on how far you see him being over the other side of centrism. Uh, but he has some fairly well reasoned takes on things. Now, the reason I've got his video up here at the moment is, well, not because I want people to, well, he is useful to listen to. He is a good, generally has a pretty good take on things. What I want to show from here is he talks about the recent media coverage of the protests around the world for various reasons. He brings up, about halfway through, he brings up a very good point about some protests going on that I'll admit I had not seen any coverage of in Australian media, either positive or negative. Now, a lot of the protests he's talking about, I see coverage of it in the Australian media, generally slanted in one particular direction, but it's still being covered. It's still being acknowledged that these things are going on. Just they want you to believe a certain way about it. What he talks about here is another series of protests that, by rights, should be being covered. I mean, it's important to know that there is this level of protest going on in some nations that just isn't being cognitively brought to the forefront of people's minds. And this peripherally ties into things I was talking about previously about it seems that protesters have a single space memory. They can't focus on more than one thing at a time. And so when the more recent flare up of Palestinian Israeli conflict took place, there was that switch away from protesting about what's going on in Ukraine. And you saw that disappearance of Ukrainian flags from protests and the sudden mass appearance of Palestinian flags. And that then also ties into, well, without the eyes of the media, without the eyes of the protest class focusing on them, it gives people more chance to get away with doing things that they probably shouldn't. So he covers, I'll run through and I'll pause
Kirk
for
is
every
starting
place.
a revolution all across America, but I had no idea he'd have such an impact in the UK, all the way down to marches in Australia and back up to movements in South Korea.
Well, okay, I just saw something. Okay, so Australian protests. You have a variety of flags being flown here, which is very interesting. It is clear that this is the protest. Well, it's been painted as anti-immigration protests, much like associated with the Nazis, the NSN, etc. It's also very clear just by looking. People are sticking to the road, sticking to the protest path, etc. This flag. Do I see the cursor? Okay, right there. The Southern Cross flag. A very interesting protest, a very interesting flag. Started out as a protest flag. Then, the Eureka Stockade. Okay, Australian goldfields in Victoria in the 1800s. You used to have to pay for a gold license. It was irrespective of how much gold you actually dug up. So there were a lot of miners, in fact, the majority of miners didn't make money from mining. And they felt that the price of the gold license was extortionate. At the time, Victoria was a British colony. Australia was a series of semi-independent British colonies. Each colony had its own administrative head and management and were basically administered and run independent from each other. So New South Wales, or even now, New South Wales and Victoria are probably the most at each other's throats or see each other as most independent of each other. But each of the Australian colonies were sort of distinct entities. The concept of Australia as a nation didn't emerge until 1901 with Federation, when the colonial period ended and Federation began, and the Australian nation started to emerge from the prior independent, like the prior colonies. It also goes to explain in some way how different some of the states are, even though they're all founded roughly within 50 years of each other, because of the way they were set up and established. I mean, South Australia was not a penal colony. They were a free settler state, and it's still a big part of their identity. The way that those states evolved and grew and everything else, yeah, there's still echoes of that colonial setup in the modern Australian state. State, not nation state. I mean, there are echoes in the nation state as well. But anyway, so back to the Eureka Stockade, back to the flag here. So it got to a point that the miners rebelled, and the government sent in troops, i.e. British troops, to enforce the collection of gold license fees, and the miners refused to pay. And the troops went heavy-handed, at which point the miners rebelled almost as one and set up and turned the goldfields into a battle zone, into a war zone. They fortified the goldfields with the Eureka Stockade. And so it's on the Eureka goldfields, not far outside of Bendigo. It's like, seriously, there are some really, really interesting parts of Australian history, relatively easily accessible. And they weren't the only goldfields active at the time. There were some really horrific behaviours in New South Wales goldfields at the time, with the Chinese coolies, in essence. I mean, that's obviously a term that's gone by the wayside, but that's what they were there as initially. And you have the Lambing Flat massacre, which is kind of unique in that it's a massacre of an ethnic group by colonial settlers or colonials, but it wasn't of Aboriginal people. They slaughtered the Chinese on the goldfields at Lambing Flat, just outside of Young. Now, funnily enough, the AM radio station that operated out of Young, I don't know if it's still there, probably fallen by the wayside like a lot of AM stations, was 2LF, to Lambing Flat. And so for all the things that Young had and has going for it, like the being centre of a large cherry producing region and things like that, and there's other elements too, they reflect their position as highlighting, I guess, a bloody experience from history in Lambing Flat. But anyway, back to the Victorian goldfields. So big, mainly around Bendigo area. So they set up a stockade, basically fortified their position, miners on the inside, troops on the outside. And eventually the troops overcame the defences. There were a few deaths, mainly on the side of the miners, but comparatively few for armed troops assaulting a fortified position, and the leaders of the miners, so the elected leaders, and these were democratically elected basically on the goldfields to represent their interests, by and large survived. Peter Lalor being one of them, and the miners had this flag that they'd set up to represent, to identify themselves and represent their interests, the Southern Cross flag. And in fact, I think it's in the State Museum of Victoria. I don't think, or it could actually be at the State Library of Victoria. They have the original Eureka Stockade flag, or what's left of it, from Peter Lalor's effectively unionisation on the goldfields. He was arrested, court cases, etc. There was minor judicial punishment handed down for a bunch of them, but people like Peter Lalor were able to articulate their ways and explain why they'd done it, etc., and went on to become politicians in their own right. And the Southern Cross flag and the concepts that Peter Lalor were putting forward effectively led to the formation of the Australian Labor Party. Now, the Australian Labor Party was formed up in Tenterfield in northern New South Wales, a farming region. I don't think it was forestry as such, but the association of the Southern Cross flag with the union movement in particular, and more so with the Australian Labor Party, because of, again, that historic association. So when you see this march for, I guess, what's painted as anti-immigration, but these march for national interests, okay, these red flags are, well, I often see them as maritime flags. So there is a specific reason for them. Like, they are a legitimate flag slash standard for use in Australia, or has been used historically. I'd have to go back and double check what the association for that is. But this one is really interesting to see in the midst, in fact, multiple of them, in the midst of something that is painted as being far right. Because traditionally, and I think if the unions found out they'd been painted as far right, that they'd, well, right. To see that appear in this, I mean, it's been co-opted. Yeah, you see the Southern Cross as a symbol of national identity and nationalism and things like that. It's the open carriage and display of this flag in the midst of a, well, nominally right-wing protest that stands out. And it's one of those things they say, people say, you look at the protest, look at the flags, it'll give you an idea, well, one, what it's about, and two, the sort of people you're looking at. Protest for Australia, you're looking at predominantly Australian flags. All right, based on media reporting, you're looking at a conservative protest or a right-wing protest, maybe extreme right-wing. You don't see Palestinian or Ukrainian flags or really much of anything else. In fact, you're hard pressed. I don't even think there's any New Zealand flags. There better not be. No, they all look like Australian flags of some form or another. But the point Decoy Voice is having here is that you're seeing
in Australia and back up to movements in South Korea.
Okay, you're seeing this support for what Charlie Kirk stood for appearing, and solidarity with his recent assassination. The thing I hadn't heard of, and this is one of them, is protests in South Korea. These, I believe, are more in solidarity with Turning Point and Charlie Kirk more than protests along national lines. But again, you look at the flags, they're predominantly South Korean, the occasional American flag because they're representing solidarity for the death of an American. But based on the fact that they're all carrying very similar placards and wearing shirts and stuff, I think this was a protest in solidarity with Charlie Kirk's message.
Yeah, where ironically, this reminds me of those recent riots in France 4 days ago, where the far left burned a Korean restaurant in protest of French leadership, as these concurrent protests just highlight the key differences between the left and the right. As reportedly, this TikTok was about Charlie.
The best part of this whole thing is that he is not martyr material, so his death will mean nothing. It will activate no one. It will impact few. It's just great.
Completely oblivious to the...
Yeah, so, I mean, the underlying message of this particular video from Decoy Voice is that, well, the message of Charlie Kirk and what he was stood for and everything else has now basically taken on a life of its own that won't be stopped or can't be stopped. Well, there you go. It says it in the description as well. But also looks at how it's been covered, and therefore there's certainly a lot of argument back. If you look at any social media, really, or even normal media, there was in the immediate aftermath an emergence of hateful rhetoric targeting not only Charlie Kirk but supporters and people on that side of the line. And almost straight away there was a pushback of people saying, well, he was murdered for his speech. The least that can happen is that your employers or places you go for education are made aware of your hateful speech. And there's certainly a lot of people suddenly facing consequences for things that they've said or done. And that's a bit of a change. And it is discussed not only by Decoy Voice, but it's also discussed by a lot of, again, mainly right-wing commentators, but they're looking at saying that, look at COVID, the people who were reluctant to commit to the COVID vaccine or the lockdowns and the nature of the controls that were put in place, the speech directed against them. G'day, third string. No worries, mate. Thank you for the lurk. The speech directed against them was such that, well, if you lost your job or if you lost your income or you lost access to things, tough luck. You deserve it. And that's one recent clear example. I mean, there were people who supported Trump in 2016 and again in 2020, in 2024, and everywhere in between, who were being targeted for their open support of him. More so in, I guess, nominally liberal areas, but there were certainly places and people where they were forced to remain silent. Otherwise, they risked their place at education institutions. They potentially risked their place in the workplace, or anybody with, I guess, even remotely conservative views were often silenced. And again, this is one of those things that when Elon Musk bought Twitter/X, that it showed that there were active policies in place to suppress viewpoints that were outside that liberalized bubble. And it misrepresented the popularity of those viewpoints. It misrepresented the extremity of viewpoints, because anything that was being suppressed was painted as an extreme viewpoint. When we go back to that just previous video, which talked about where conservatism is considered to sit on the spectrum and redefining the spectrum, that anything that was even remotely like that was then painted as far right. And when we look at the other news articles that I do have lined up for today, you'll see how many of them paint even anything that has a remotely conservative slant to it as being far right or extreme. And so it makes it very hard, as Charlie Kirk found out and was trying to overcome, hard to engage in a discussion, hard to engage in an effort to better understand political position and maybe change it if needs be, when anything outside of those echo bubbles is considered extremism. And yeah, it's hard to rationalize it and hard to have a fair and level-headed discussion or approach to things when merely appearing to discuss it or even attempting to discuss it attracts hostile speech. Now, people, one reason I think a lot of people feel very upset about what happened, like a lot of, I saw something from Theo Von last night. I don't think he is considered conservative, but he was shaken up by what happened. He'd never met Charlie Kirk. He knew very little about it. But the way I took what he had to say was that the assassination of Charlie Kirk sent a chill through him, and it sort of made him realize how vulnerable he is if someone like Charlie Kirk could be killed in an instant. And that anybody who has this large social media presence or large media presence is at risk. And you look at some of the larger commentators online, some of whom are drifting more conservative over time. I mean, even you look at people like Asmongold. Obviously, he's very busy at the moment with his family concerns, but you can see how shaken up he was when he went to discuss what was going on. Now, he's more over time been showing more conservative content in his clip streams and things like that. And he freely admitted that he never voted for Trump, that he was probably Clinton aligned in 2016. He wasn't really paying attention to media or anything like to politics or anything like that. But I think it seems that his real world experience is starting to send him down this path. But certainly someone like Asmongold, who's seen as like the most popular streamer and stuff at the moment, probably starting to consider the vulnerability that he is in, that he's positioned in. And you've got other voices kind of associated with Asmongold, like Tectone. He was taking time off for other reasons. His immediate reactions that he put online, he was shaken to his core. And I think he saw that up until this point, it's just been a lot of rhetoric, largely sometimes being resolved in the courts, but very rarely going to a physical level of outcome. And he's been seeing that how violently someone can meet their end for espousing ideas in a fairly moderate way when compared to the way he engages in things, or people like Destiny or Hassan Piker and people like that. They tend to paint a more, not so much a more extreme viewpoint, the manner in which their viewpoint is delivered is a little more extreme. And the idea is, well, if somebody who, whilst they might have ideas and positions that are considered a bit far away from centrism, if they can meet a violent end so suddenly just by going about things in a fairly benign manner, I mean, it's confrontational, but it's not violent, it's not being screamed at, then what risk are they at? What risk are these other content creators at? And I think that was the chill that went through. And obviously, there were a lot of people who admitted to supporting his ideas, maybe disagreeing with others. And I mean, I don't think anyone necessarily fully agreed with him, but they still at least believed in the idea of being able to openly discuss things, that the First Amendment provided the protections to be able to go out and do that. And yep, certainly I think what I've seen is that there's a lot of people in the US community, content creation community, that are that have held a chill because of this. And will it tone down the rhetoric? Will it not I mean, people will still believe what they want to believe, still espouse those ideas, but the manner in which they espouse those ideas, I think, will be more toned down. On top of all the other things that are going on, stopping content creation and stuff at the moment. And there's also been suppression of ideas in the past. Like I said, it took until Elon Musk bought X, Twitter, for the boot to come off the speech of many conservative voices. And so there are things going on. I mean, there's issues with Twitch, with botting, and all the other bits and pieces at the moment. The arbitrariness of bans, all the other bits and pieces. There's stuff on YouTube about shadow banning of certain content, and people are still arguing and fighting against ideologies held by creation companies and by streaming services. Those things just haven't changed and won't change anytime soon. So yeah, there was certainly has been a surprising outpouring, and people are saying that if this had happened before Elon Musk bought Twitter, it would have disappeared. There would have been no coverage. It would be like the sad events that led to the Ukrainian refugee who died in Charlottesville recently, Irina. That, as it wasn't covered for at least 2 weeks after the incident. She was attacked and died in August, in mid to late August. Yet it took until September before it caught on. And part of the immediate narrative around it was, why did it take so long for something like this to come to light? Is there because there was a racial element? Is there because there is an element that is keeping it out of narrative, out of coverage? Because it's hard to say, how do we say that our nations are safe places for Ukrainian refugees when this can happen completely arbitrarily, when it seems that there was no provocation? When you look at the bystander effect going on of the fact that it wasn't till she was effectively bled out on the floor before somebody came to help. And people are looking at that and the rather horrific video and contemplating what it means to people's own belief in society, people's belief in what we do as individuals, how we respond to those sort of things, and why nothing was done. Now, I can tell you from first-hand experience, it's called the bystander effect. It's fight, flight, or freeze. People might tell themselves, oh, I'll do X, Y, Z when something happens. You don't know what your reaction's going to be until you get in that situation. You can be as full of bluster as you want. It's like, I'm sure that there's plenty of people out there who served in the military, particularly in the arms corps, who had people they went through basic training with, who were basically puffed up their chest at any opportunity, talked about, well, I mean, those sort of people actually do get weeded out rather quick, but had this very gung-ho attitude. Yet the moment they hit the actual battlefield, it evaporated. Not that they were cowards, but they faced reality, and it was nothing like the narrative they created about what it was going to be like. I read an inquiry in the Australian Army, I think. Yes, about an incident that took place. Well, basically, it was an inquiry into the death of a member after they'd returned from Afghanistan, and whilst they weren't directly part of the special forces, they were attached to them, and basically what had happened was they had this gung-ho attitude towards things and had this concept of what it was going to be like, managed to convince the patrol commanders to let them come out on patrol. There was contact, and there were a couple of Afghanis killed and at least one severely wounded. Now, they were mortally wounded in the end, but they lived long enough to crawl away from the battlefield, and obviously in post-contact cleanup, they obviously had to go and follow the blood trail and everything else. And this guy had not necessarily been trained as an arms corps, like hadn't been trained necessarily as infantry. Certainly had no exposure prior to this, and came home from the conflict, came home from deployment broken, because the person that had been mortally wounded and crawled off the battlefield was a 14-year-old kid. And this guy believed he'd gut shot him and couldn't live with it. Couldn't live with it. And there was and then the bloke ended up taking his own life. But the inquiry basically went into looked at why he was even allowed to be on the battlefield in the first place, but then why there was no follow-up support when it was realised, oops, he's gone and done something he probably shouldn't have, but there was no recognition that it was going to be rather upsetting and fundamentally change the poor person. But it was an interesting inquiry, not just because of what happened fundamentally at the end, but it was the whole, how did it get to the point this guy got on the battlefield, and what he was like before he got out there and got into contact, and what happened afterwards in terms of the reality of firing a weapon in anger, of hitting somebody and not killing them outright, and all these things, of all these psychological concepts that people are like, oh, I'll do this or I'll do that. It's different when you smell the blood and the guts. It's not the same. And people who tell you that they know what they're going to do, generally you want to stay very far away from. But anyway, how did we get to that? A bit of a tangent. Yeah, no, actually, no. People talking about claiming they're going to do X, Y, Z, and well, the reality is slightly different. And so, I think people now are coming out of this, in addition to the level of support that was somewhat surprising, but the pushback against hatred of hateful rhetoric. Now, depending on which side of the argument you sit, you might say that's not hateful rhetoric. On the other side, it's like, oh, yes, it is. You were calling for violence. You were calling for violent acts against others, and we've just seen firsthand what happens ultimately. It's telling that you see people like Bill Maher, that like Colbert, suddenly backtracking in their speeches and in their shows and stuff not long after the assassination. You see them nervous, in part because I think they realise there is as much risk as Charlie Kirk was, but also because they've been advocating. I mean, even The View seemed very contrite afterwards. You've got this idea that people are suddenly waking up to the fact that, hang on, all this stuff I've said over the previous X number of years, not only is it going to come back to bite me and I'm going to face consequences for it, but it's contributed to the polarization. It's potentially contributed to the person getting into the position where he put his finger on the trigger. Was it my speech that put him in there? It's the inciting to violence that is the problem. So anyway, that's not the reason I brought up
the vigils hitting
Decoy
college
Voice initially.
campuses, with huge crowds even in New York City as NASCAR races paid their respects, but also MLB games as the New York Yankees had a moment of silence alongside the NFL also honoring his life. But then we started.
So the other thing that stood out, okay, coming from an Australian who's not involved in US politics, at least not directly, we have to suffer the consequences like everybody else. It stood out, one, I guess, how conservative a lot of society still is, even if they don't get to say it, the old silent Tory effect. But two, the level of impact that Charlie Kirk had. I mean, prior to his death, I don't think I would have said that the impact of his life was on that sort of a level. Not realizing how much of a power broker he'd ended up being with, say, JD Vance getting into the position he did, of the fact that, as I said, NASCAR recognized him, that the Yankees recognized him, that you've got these large organizations that didn't seem to stop for much else suddenly recognizing it. It's like, well, maybe the impact of his life through death was far greater than people expected, and it's going to be interesting to see. Is it Cardinal Stadium, I believe, where the funeral's going to be held, the public funeral at least? How that is going to be attended, and obviously you've got these vigils that appeared around the place, and various people for and against. It's one of those things that just boggles the mind somewhat. And there was a comment made by there's a commentator. Who were they? There's someone I don't normally listen to, but I listened to it because they were talking about it. I was like, well, they don't normally talk about this sort of stuff. It wasn't Clownfish TV. It was somebody else. But the point of what they were saying was, there are these key events in history. There are times when it feels like the rules have changed. And they said that the only other time in history they've felt that the society or the world has changed fundamentally, that the rules of society have changed, that the rules have overall changed, was September 11, 2001, when Bush was notified of the attacks while he was reading the book to the kindergartners. That particular image and exchange was where this commentator felt the rules had changed. The future was being put down a path based on this seminal event, and that whatever the world had been up till the 10th of September, or till 5 a.m. on the 11th, it was no longer going to be the same. And they've said that and they were a commentator that didn't really listen to Charlie Kirk, had never met them, didn't communicate with them, anything like that. But they said that they felt that this assassination was the same sort of thing, that for some reason, they couldn't explain it beforehand, but for some reason, and probably could still struggle to explain why exactly it was him, why the impact is so great, but saying that it feels different coming out. Now, I reckon a big part of it is people realizing online hateful rhetoric has real-world consequences. And not only that, like I was saying with Theo Von and a bunch of the other high-profile content producers, is they've had this chilling effect go through them of, wait a second, I'm more vulnerable than that, or I'm as vulnerable than that. It's like everybody attracts haters online because it's anonymous generally. It's like, well, which one of my haters is going to go to that extreme? Have I said or done things that have upset people that much? Well, a lot of conservative commentators have felt that in their comment sections and things like that. Left-leaning ones, probably not so much, but it still raises the question of how safe and secure people feel in their own space. And also I think the other reason why they feel this turning point as such in history is that it was not somebody who was inflammatory in their way they delivered their rhetoric. And I mean, people sometimes felt his positions were inflammatory, but he delivered them in a calm manner and tried to find common ground. I think people would say that if someone like Alex Jones had, not been killed, but if it had been someone like Alex Jones instead, people would be like, well, it's because of the way he delivered his message, because of how extreme not just his viewpoints, but the manner in which he delivers his message is antagonistic. But Charlie Kirk was rarely antagonistic. I mean, in the one-on-one debates, when people weren't listening or they were talking over each other, it seemed a bit antagonistic at times. But it was certainly not on the level of, say, someone like an Alex Jones or a Bill Maher or The View or a Colbert, or you get the message. And so I think that's part of it too, is people up until early September were battling over the idea of suppression of thought on the internet, of what the Online Surveillance Safety Act in the UK was going to do, what the banning of social media for under 16s in Australia was going to do. People were looking at these as being suppressions of thought and speech and everything else. Now, I think those those political means are probably going to get expanded upon and probably be forced down the pipeline a little bit more. But I think people are concerned that it's potentially going to be aligned or politically implemented. Who knows? But anyway, so going back to
seeing
Decoy Voice.
Spain paying their respects, torches all the way in Australia holding up signs for Charlie, with South Korean citizens singing "We are Charlie Kirk." Where we all knew the assassination of Charlie Kirk was going to ignite American conservatives and moderates, but nobody could have imagined he would become the face of freedom for the entire planet. As at the UK's Unite the Kingdom march, which was reported as 110,000 people, but was more likely millions.
This is the counter-revolution. There's been a globalist revolution for 20 years. We are the counter-revolution. It's not going anywhere, mate.
Carrying posters of not only Charlie Kirk, but his entire family, as they all rallied behind his memory.
To Charlie's family, we all pray for you, and we hope we honour his life.
So, of course, the left tried to make this about the spooky far-right.
What you're seeing here is probably the biggest far-right demonstration ever held in Britain. And I've been among this crowd.
So, as I was saying, the positioning in the media and everything else is that, any expression of national identity is considered far-right by people who are light in skin tone, I guess. It's a very racist thing to be saying by them, but hey, it fits their ideology. But it's also an excuse for them to put hateful rhetoric against those who attended and those who marched.
And I think it's obvious that many of the people here are wearing our flag as a badge of their own white identity and as a mark of hatred of our multicultural, multinational society.
But who knew the UK?
So those sort of opinions are actually fairly standard in the media. So it's not like that guy's some random engaged in horrible hatred. That's going to be a fairly common viewpoint you're going to see.
His far-right was so diverse.
そして昔のイギリスを取り戻そうとしてる。これ、日本でもやらんと。
Erica Kerr, this is for you. We love you. We stand with you. We will always have your back, and we love your husband, Charlie.
I have to come and support the event, uniting the whole country, bringing everybody together, bringing the four nations together. That's why I dress up and then come and support. I'll be integrated, so I have to respect the culture.
And notice how nobody was shouting down any of those very diverse conservatives, as they're all embracing Western culture and rejecting liberal tyranny. But nothing scares a political elite more than when the common man bands together against the ruling class. So they immediately went back to their same old tired playbook.
Show me what community looks like. This is what community looks like.
Of protesters that mysteriously get these signs left behind by these mysterious figures, who they later discovered are funded by none other than their own tax dollars. Kinda interesting how the same exact...
Now, there's another video out there not in support of this, talking to a politician who was in attendance at that counter protest. In the background, you see a couple of people with some of those signs, and the actually has a little banner across the top explaining who provided the sign or what organisation they're more associated with, and it's one of the not Socialist International, but one of the very socialist parties, and it's like well accepted that they're heavily socialist. So if you're looking at the ideology, at least the openly espoused ideology of these counter protests, there you go. Very hard left, despite what they might be waving signs for.
Thing was happening in the US until the Trump administration started tracing who was funding these riots, and they evaporated overnight. So of course, to offset millions of angry Englishmen, masked Antifa and Black Bloc had to make an appearance, chanting disgusting phrases.
This is for all the people that want to be here on our side, but
Where their cappers initially admitted.
So there's a little bit of misinformation that sort of creeps out here. Now, speech like that, I mean, Keir Starmer came out and said, "Oh no, the UK's had free speech." Well, no, that's actually hate speech. But anyway, the sort of thing that people are surprised. What do you mean I'm getting consequences for saying hateful things like that? It's maddening that people think that that's an appropriate thing to say, irrespective of whether you agree with what that person stood for. It's like the last several years of online discourse have emboldened people because they've never faced pushback. They've existed in an echo chamber that sort of supports them completely. Now, the clashes from the marches in the UK, apparently there was a change of the route at last minute, that the Met Police blocked off one of the accepted route, and so that was the reason why you had that eventual footage of protesters breaking police lines of horrible violence. Well, it's because the police had blocked off the march route that had been approved and accepted. Now, they only had a fraction of the main parade size, but where the disorder points are, it's like, well, unless the main parade broke off and went through the embankment and the rest of central London to intentionally seek conflict, I doubt. And it goes back to the discussion we'd had the other day about the protests in Victoria, in Australia, but mainly Victoria, where there was conflict. And it's evident that it's the counter-protesters who, whilst being in a much smaller protest, were the ones that closed and engaged in violence. Yet the coverage of the event by the media is that it was instigated by the other side, and sort of don't look at it very closely because otherwise the misleading information would be exposed. The other thing too that comes out of this is the number of arrests that took place, not just here. There was like protests in Australia that at least this weekend just gone, the protests, the arrests were certainly now targeting leftist agitators a lot more. And that was a surprise. Now, whether that stays the same going forward or it goes back to more arrests of, not a fair distribution of arrests, we'll see. But it was surprising that the media even acknowledged that most of the arrests had come from the counter-protests and agitators this last weekend.
The problem areas weren't with the Unite the Kingdom marchers, but the Antifa idiots, to which the Met Police marched them right into each other, just so they could later state there was significant aggression directed at officers.
And again, putting paid to the lie of there's free speech in the UK is the fact that the Met Police prevent people from replying. So there's no ability to counter what is being said or to support it, if that's what people want.
By the Unite the Kingdom protesters, but also turning off the replies, as the mainstream media rushed to echo those sentiments, stating far-right activists with clashes breaking out.
Marching through the streets of London, one of the largest right-wing demonstrations to take place in the UK in modern times. Organized by the far-right anti-immigration activist Tommy Robinson, close by a much smaller counter-protest organized by anti-racism activists.
I'm just really against racism.
Organized by anti-racism activists.
I'm just really against.
Okay, so that says say no to racism. The actual party responsible for the banners, probably down the bottom there, a bit hard to see on that one.
So close at one point that right-wing marchers began throwing things at them and pushing police.
London's Metropolitan Police said a number of its officers were assaulted by the right-wing demonstrators, Dorica, and that 25 people were arrested.
It really seems like every single time they start to lose control, they revert back to the same exact plays. As in this enormous march across the UK, I didn't see a single incident of property damage, compared to neighboring France that had their own riots 4 days earlier, as it initially started with the French angry at their political leadership. But
okay, so these protests were not covered anywhere in Australian media that I saw. There was obviously a coverage of the French Prime Minister resigning / being sacked, but there was a brief mention of an attempt to have a protest of a sort, sort of a shut down things. But the extent of the protests and what took place, no coverage. Mind you, the French will protest at the drop of a hat, but
then women carrying French flags were being attacked by those not, with the Block Everything protests beginning to build barricades in the street, making makeshift roadblocks to stop traffic. And then burning buses to stop the streets, as sadly, that wasn't the only place they used fire on the freeways, as they specifically burned a Korean restaurant, later attacking the responding French police with trash cans. But the mainstream media didn't seem to cover it like the Unite the Kingdom rally, where they seemed to make it more about pressure on the government and how it started online in far-right circles.
So this statement is hard to reconcile. That starts in far-right circles, co-opted by left-wing anti-fascist and anarchist groups. Now, that makes very little sense. But if we go back to that previous video where we talked about whether the professor was talking about changing your concept of understanding the spectrum of political ideology, where the far left and far right are more closely aligned because of their desire for an authoritarian existence for everybody else. It's no surprise, although the idea of anarchists being involved, yeah.
But now happens to have left-wing groups. So when the left burns down entire sections of the city, they're protesters in Paris. But if the entire community marches against the establishment, that's the far-right clashing with the police. But they only classify you as far-right, so they can later call you a fascist, as they simultaneously encourage psychos online. They need to eliminate these evil fascists. But now, normal people no longer fear being called a fascist when they just...
So the other part of it too is the government in France is a fairly weak coalition. Was attempted to offset National Front, or I think that's what they're called now. Marine Le Pen's political party that had swept in and was looking to take power of its own accord. So there was a coalition of very disparate leftist parties, all of whom hated each other, and basically hated each other because they either thought they didn't go far enough to implement socialism or had gone too far to do their socialist policies. And so they tried to create a coalition to basically counter Marine Le Pen. So the fact the Prime Minister was sacked or resigned shouldn't have come as a surprise to anyone. But the fact that it's largely leftist protesters protesting a leftist government, or the failure of a leftist government to support being a leftist government, is probably why we're not seeing any coverage of that, and there's probably a lot of ideological support in the media for it, so they're going to, paper over it and pretend that it's nothing significant.
Just murdered Charlie Kirk over allegedly being one, when all he was doing was having conversations and spreading the truth. And the more the left goes into overdrive trying to silence anybody that notices, the more the average citizen is finally saying no to their political violence. So as the calls for political violence have only amplified, people are now losing their jobs in neurology at universities. Microsoft is combing through their ranks to do the same, and even American Airlines is firing pilots who think it's okay to celebrate murder. As we're seeing a turning point, not only in the US, with Americans making it their mission to dish out consequences, but now conservatives worldwide are rallying behind Charlie, as the left didn't even think he'd be seen as a martyr, but now Charlie's known globally as the face of finally fighting back. So if you appreciate my concise...
Right. Okay, so, the reason I put that video up was not for the majority of it. I mean, there's all good points, but was to focus on the coverage of the protests and to basically point out the issues surrounding the French protests